So I'm going to be talking about a computational neurophenomenological account of meditation. That's a mouthful, right? But in fact, it's about trying to bridge this first-person perspective. Oh, doesn't quite work, but this first-person perspective, which is here on the left, you can see of our conscious experience, and the third-person perspectives of what's going on in the brain, the neural goings-on in the brain. And obviously in the last 20 or 30 years, we've started to learn quite a lot about meditation. In fact, today we're going to be hearing from one of the great pioneers, Professor Sarah Lazar from Harvard, who actually was the first person to find the smoking gun and see neural changes induced by meditation. But kind of seeing blobs on brain scans and connecting that with our first-person phenomenology needs a bridge. And there's a big problem here because there is a very difficult issue of finding something called the explanatory gap between the neuroscience of meditation and our first-person phenomenology, and it's deeply linked to this philosophical issue called the hard problem of consciousness. But we've started to be able to find a bridge between them, and the way to do it is not to directly try to bridge this gap, but to find a bypass. And the bypass is something called computational neurophenomenology, which is essentially finding a computational model of the brain which gives us a model of what's going on, of the neural mechanisms of what's going on in the brain, but at the same time, this computational model is giving us a model of the phenomenology, of what our experience is. So that's interesting. If we can find a modeling technique that gives us a model of our first-person phenomenology and an idea of what's going on in the brain, we can start to make some progress. So, let's take a step back. Imagine you're looking at a tree, and you're there. So what's going on here? Well, somehow your mind has an impression of a tree. The tree is being represented in your mind. In fact, that's all that's really going on, because we don't actually see the tree in itself. We only see our representation of the tree in our minds. How does this happen? Well, this is a deep issue in philosophy, and many philosophers like Descartes have tried to answer this. And he kind of thought that there's some seeing subject behind our eyes, looking out through the windows in the front of our faces, our eyes, and looking at the world. But that is not how it could be. Perception is extremely hard. If you could actually see what's coming through your eyes, you couldn't make head or tail of it. We just have this very, very central vision, the fovea, the macula, which is about 2% of your visual field, and yet look around, you see everything here. And in fact, only the central part is in color, and look around, we see all this beautiful, colorful, cartoonish definition. In fact, here is a kind of just a hint of what it could be like to see something from the central part of your vision. In fact, this is much better than it actually is. It's very difficult to see what's going on. In fact, what's really going on is that we were seeing a flower and a bee. So this is the idea. How does our brain actually construct our experience? So Let's take a brain which is getting sensory data from the world, from your eyes, from your ears, from your body. And the idea is that this data is processed by neural networks, sometimes from the back of your head going forward, right? And as it's processed up these neural networks, the traditional idea is that the early stages of this processing extracts low-level features like edges and corners, and then the mid-level parts of this neural network extracts mid-level features like, for example, noses, eyes, ears. And then finally, we get high-level features like whole faces that are being extracted. And then somehow we figure out what's going on. It's my grandma. So that's actually the story that most neuroscientists would tell about 20 years ago. But in fact, that story turns out to be wrong. So, essentially what we've described here is a feed-forward system. For those of you who know about neural networks and artificial neural networks, that's just a feed-forward system. But when we look at the brain, we find something very strange. We find that there are about 10 times as many feedback neurons as there are feed-forward neurons. So that's inscrutable. Why would that be? And the reason is because that picture that I just gave you is completely upside down. In fact, what's going on is the other way around. What's going on is that we have certain prior beliefs about what our world is composed of. And these priors have been, we developed them growing up from babies onwards, and some of these priors are perhaps evolutionary. And you have a prior, for example, of your grandma. And what happens is that this prior then goes down the neural network, and we get predicted data, a generative model. We generate what we think is going on. We simulate what we think is going on. Kind of crazy, really. But then if we were just living in our own simulation, how do we know it's right? Well, what has to happen is that we have to compare the generated model with the sensory data that we actually get. And that comparison gives us a prediction error, the difference between the generative model and the sensory data that we actually get through our eyes, for example. And then the model is trying to minimize this prediction error. So this prediction error goes back up the brain, and then what happens is that the assumptions of the generative model, the knobs and dials and parameters of the generative model of your simulation, are adjusted so that we minimize these prediction errors. And finally, when the brain stabilizes, we get a predicted model, which is actually what we see. So this is the interesting thing. What we experience is our own internal simulation. It's just that this simulation is a special kind of simulation that's minimizing prediction errors with the sensory data. So we actually never see the sensory data. What we see, what we experience, is our technical term posterior. This is the prior, and this is the data, and this is the posterior. This is what's being generated. So this is how our experience works. And this way of looking at it is, in fact, some of these priors are very, very, very strong. Here is one of these priors that's so hardwired that it's very highly weighted And in fact, it overrules the sensory data that's coming in. We say that it's got a high precision weighting. And what you see here is a face, a hollow mask, and every time you're about to see the back of the mask, do you notice that it flips the other way around, rotates the other way, and your brain interprets the nose coming out? You can never see the nose going inwards. Actually, very interesting. Most people can't see it, but one or two in the audience might be able to. Anyone see the face going in? 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's interesting. Good. So that's maybe 5-10%, and that's a very open-minded stance. Actually, it's kind of hard to achieve. Good. Here's another one. Right. See some blotches. Very difficult to see what's going on. I don't know if anyone can put up their hand to see if anyone thinks they know what's going on. Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right. In fact, here I'll show you what this is. This is a Dalmatian on a snowy day. All right. And now I'll take it away. Now you can see it. Right. So your brain has got a prediction now and is interpreting the sensory data according to that prediction, and you now see a Dalmatian. So what's going on is that we are constantly learning our priors. We are constantly, our memories are priors about our past. This is a crazy thing. So we think that we just remember what's going on in the past. In fact, all we have is some priors, and we reconstruct what, every time we remember the past, we reconstruct exactly like you're constructing this picture here. You reconstruct your memories because you've got some priors about the past. So we are constructing our present moment, we're constructing our past, and in fact, we're constructing everything else. There isn't going to be anything. We're constructing our emotions, we're constructing all our experiences. Now you might ask, well, where do these priors come from? So we have here a low-level model in the brain, and the priors are coming from somewhere mysterious. Where do they come from? Well, they come from another model, another mid-level model, for example. So what happens is the priors come down from this high-level model and go up to this, the prediction errors go up and change the priors. And where do those priors come from? Well, they come from an even higher model. So we don't know how many layers of models there are. Maybe there are about 6 or 7 layers. We don't know exactly how it works. But what we see is that we have layers of abstraction. And what does this look like in the brain? Well, we actually know something around the cognitive hierarchy of abstraction that this implies. This is data using 17,000 fMRI experiments and then a Neuroscience data space. So it's machine learning to figure out what is the cognitive hierarchy. And what you see right at the bottom is somatosensory, basic sensations, vibrotactile, muscular. So our raw body sensations, our raw auditory sensations, not even words, not even phonemes, just the blah, 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 or the raw sensations are processed at the bottom, and then we get basic emotions, and we get motion, and then faces, and memory, and then right at the top we have language, reasoning, and abstract concepts. So somehow our brain is using abstract concepts and reasoning and language to all the way down to our low-level sensations. So we're constructing all of this. And how does it do this? Well, it does it actually in an interesting way, we actually have starting to begin to have an idea of how this works in the brain. We have these streams of models. So this I've shown here is this somatosensory screen. Somatosensations are the body sensations that are coming up through the spinal cord. And these models go up and down. So predictions flow down these models, and prediction errors go up these models. The next one is interoception. For example, where I know where my I have information about how my viscera are feeling, whether I've got a stomach ache and whether my heart is pounding. Then I have an output, viscera motor, through the autonomic nervous system, proprioception, where my arms are, the visual sense, which is actually massive. It's by far the most dominant in humans. Audition, gustation, olfaction, so taste and smell. And then finally, we have the output, which is the motor system, which is how I move my muscles and do actions in the world. Now, that starts off being processed separately, and that's called unimodal processing. And then, as we go up through the abstraction hierarchy, we start to get something called multimodal integration, where these things come together. And for example, if you clap your hands, you see a visual clapping, and then you have a sound. And even if they're slightly off, your brain will interpret them together. It will bind them together in a unified gestalt. Now, right at the top of the brain is where things really come together, and we start getting these multimodal action perception priors, these programs, these multimodal summaries of how the brain thinks the world works. And that turns out to be in an area called the default mode network, which is this very central midline hub. And what we see is that the default mode network and other networks like the frontoparietal network and the limbic system are right at the top of this hierarchy and work in an interaction of these important networks. So, but you might say, well, if that's at the center, so I've just got these prediction summaries right at the center of the top of the hierarchy, where is the self? I thought it all comes together in what is really me. Where is the self? But here the thing is, there is no self in this diagram here. So let's think about the self, because we all feel like we are a self and we have a body, and that also is a construction. So we have something which is generally termed a phenomenal self-model. And this phenomenal self-model is the seat of multisensory integration. It also has in the self-model, you have a body map. You know where your body is. You know, there's also a sense of agency, like I am the author, the prime mover of my actions. When I lift my hand, I've done that. So this is another part of the self-model. Another part of the self-model is a sense of myness. This is my arm. This is my chest. There's a sense of first-person perspectivity. I look at the world from the egocentric perspective, from me here and the light over there and the lectern over there. So there's this innate first-person perspective. Then there are wider parts of the self, like a narrative sense of self. My memories, who I am, what my personality is, all this kind of thing. But there's one thing that's very important in this phenomenal self-model, which is that the self model itself is transparent. We don't know that it's there. And the reason it's called transparent is because it's kind of like if you see a bird out the window and you see, oh, what a lovely bird on that branch in the tree there. But you don't realize that in fact you're looking through a window. And until I pointed out that you're looking through a window, that window is entirely transparent. And we just thought we were seeing the bird as it really is. Now, the window represents the modeling process itself. So we don't recognize that we are constructing ourselves and that this phenomenal self-model is a construction. So if we recognize that, something starts to change, and we'll come on to that with meditation. Now, this phenomenal self-model is surprisingly malleable. There's really an amazing experiment where you can take someone and put their hand underneath a cover and stroke their hand with a brush. And then put a rubber hand in front of them that they can see and stroke that hand, that rubber hand, at the same rate at which their real hand is being stroked. And would you believe it, in a few minutes, you think that the rubber hand is yours. That's how constructed our sense of self is. We actually feel it. Now, if you don't believe me, let's have a look at this. This is somebody who is, you can see here the rubber hand, okay? And then their real hand is somewhere just behind there. Okay, so let's have a look at this video. You can see both their real hand and their rubber hand being stroked. And I wonder if he thinks it's his hand. Oh! So this was a very funny thing. There's like another PhD student who went out and stabbed him, and he really thought it was his hand. So did everyone else. So this can really happen. And in fact, it gets worse. It gets absolutely worse, because not only can you confuse your hand, but you can actually confuse your whole body, who you are. So there's a full body version of the rubber hand illusion called the full body illusion, where what you do is you're being stroked on the back of your on your back with a brush, for example, and you're wearing a virtual reality headset. So you're wearing a headset, and you're being filmed from behind you, and that's what's being played on your headset. So you're being stroked behind your back by a PhD student, and what you see is someone in front of you being stroked exactly in time with the way you're being stroked. And there's this very strange thing that happens after a couple of minutes. You think, this is strange. I'm over there in front of me. Why can I see myself from behind myself? It's a really strange thing. So we just naively take ourselves to be this body, but in fact, that's just an internal model, an internal simulation. And you can really play around with it. You can play around with it. You know, people have out-of-body experiences spontaneously. People have out-of-body experiences with psychedelics. And meditation is a generalized technology to start to deconstruct ourselves. So let's put this together. So we're standing here in front of the tree. And this is grayed out because actually we don't know what reality is. We're only always within our own models. And we receive some external data from the tree. We receive some internal data through this interoceptive system from our body sensations. And what we have is our generative phenomenal world model. Remember this generative model that's creating, that the brain is simulating? And what's in this generative model? Well, we have a tree here. We have ourselves being represented, our body map. We have an idea that we're here. And this is very important, that we have within our own world model a model of ourselves, because if we didn't have a model of ourselves from an evolutionary perspective, we wouldn't know how to move. For example, if I need to know where I am, if there's a tiger over there, then I can run up the tree over there. So this is very important to have a sense of a world model, otherwise we wouldn't have survived. And what else is going on? Well, there's some thoughts, some internal dialogue that's here. Maybe it's visual thoughts, some sort of visual sensations, or maybe it's some internal dialogue, blah, 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 this is happening, this is happening. And what else is in my phenomenal world model? Well, I have a sense of my body sensations, of my viscera, and I can also smell what's going on in the world. There's also a sense of the breath at my nose, for example. Perhaps there's a sense of my heartbeat over here. I can hear sounds in the room, sounds in the environment. There's all the emotions which are felt in my body, but there's all sorts of emotions that are being generated. And of course, those are constructions as well. But where is the phenomenal self model? Well, in fact, the phenomenal self model is a data structure. It's a data structure, and this is how it looks. This is an idea of putting it together. So some part of your world model becomes a phenomenal self model, and that's called the subject. The internal things, well, thoughts are internal to me, my body sensations are internal to me, my emotions are internal to me, my viscera, my heart rate. And then you have the external world, the object, and we have a subject-object duality within our own phenomenal world model. So we normally think that we are the subject and there's a world out there, an object, but now what we're saying is that both subject and object are constructions within our phenomenal world model. There's also a sense of being an agent in this model, and that's also a construction, weirdly. And there's a sense of a first-person perspectivity. And most importantly, there is a transparency. We don't realize that we are constructing this whole simulation. So, what happens in meditation? Well, the meditation that Payal led started off with a kind of a focused attention. She got us to pay attention perhaps to breath at our nose. So for example, if we increased the prior of the breath of the nose and therefore decreased the relative priors of everything else, because one of the things is that attention only adds up to 100%. So if you put 80% of your attention on breath of the nose, what happens? Well, we call it technically increased precision weighting, or increased the level of the prior of breath of the nose, and decreased priors for everything else. And then what happened? Perhaps you might have noticed this. Perhaps you might have noticed that what happens is that your conscious gestalt was dominated by the breath of the nose. And other parts of your phenomenal world model were quieter. So, but there's more than that. because what we can actually do is start to deconstruct our world. So we remember that what happened was that we fabricate up the world from these edges and corners to mid-level models to high-level models, and then we perceive objects. Well, in meditation, what you can do is go the other way around. You can unfabricate. You can unfabricate or deconstruct all these objects. So instead of seeing, for example, whole objects like whole cars, you can just break them down and see the parts of all the cars. So instead of seeing your body as this one thing, or your arm is this one thing, you can start to become aware of the fine body sensations, and then your arm becomes this kind of cloud of shimmering, vibratory, ephemeral sensations. So objects become processes, and things that are concepts start breaking down. Even the words that you're saying can break down. You know, have you ever said a word again and again until it starts losing its meanings? Like if I say flowers, 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 you'll actually go through something called semantic satiation, and you'll start hearing the phonemes, and even below that, just the prosodic sensations. So this is all a bit like one of the old-fashioned monitors. This is some sort of, I don't know, Windows 2000 system here, an old monitor. And if you look at it, you see this kind of picture of default monitor and whatever. But if we zoom in fact, all there is just RGB pixels. And so we lose the idea of there being a monitor, and we see that it's all constructed of a single type of thing, which is just these pixels. So in the idea that we discussed, this computational view, what's really going on in this deconstruction is that we are reducing the weighting of these high-level priors, these high-level concepts and thoughts and higher beliefs, and therefore our conscious gestalt is dominated by these low-level sensations. But the reason we do that, the reason we deconstruct, is that just as we saw that the monitor, the illusion that there was something on the monitor, when you really see it's just made of pixels, what you see is that you de-reify it. You can no longer see it as a real thing. If you don't perceive your arm anymore, but just see a cloud of sensations, then the arm is not real. It's not a real thing. You start understanding that the arm was just a construction. It wasn't the real thing in itself. It wasn't the actual object out there. Of course, that's all going on in my mind. You start to de-reify. Reification is believing it's real. And the technical term in Buddhist psychology is called emptiness. And the technical term that we introduced was opacification, opaque rather than transparent. So the self-model is transparent, you can make it opaque, you can see that it's a construction. Now, putting it together, we then see that the world becomes deconstructed. And if we've done our calming meditation, it also becomes very quiet. And then, at that stage, it's possible to recognize something. It's possible to recognize the empty space of phenomenal experience itself. So this is beyond what's actually happening, what the phenomena are. now we start to recognize the substrate of the generative model itself, the nature or essence of mind itself. And this experience can be called non-dual awareness. It's called non-dual awareness because both subject and object arise within it. It is beyond the duality of subject and object. We normally perceive that we perceive something else. The subject perceives an object. But now, this is the ground of all awareness, both subject and object side. And this non-dual awareness, the metaphors that are used in the traditions are something like, you just normally see reflections in a mirror and you don't know that there's a mirror there. And then you recognize that there is a mirror, and all you're seeing is the mirror, in fact. Another classic metaphor is that we see a movie sometimes and all sorts of things going on, action movie and people shooting each other, and characters on the movie. And one of the funny things is that we take ourselves to be one of the characters in the movie. And then maybe someone turns down the illumination or turns off the power maybe, and we recognize the screen itself. We recognize that actually there wasn't anything else but the screen. So this is the substrate of the generative model. Another classic one is the sky and clouds or weather within the sky. So we just normally get all engrossed in the weather in the sky, but the sky is always there and everything is happening within the sky. Or you can think about an ocean and the waves. You just normally see objects as these waves moving around, and you don't recognize that it's one ocean. And that is the ocean of your own awareness. So, you come back from meditation, and then you can also bring back what we found, which is we can say, look, that space of the generative model is still there. So you bring something back, and then your perception is changed forever, because you are now aware that everything is made of awareness. And so you can see that. And they're all, I won't go into this, but there are lots of terms for this kind of non-dual awareness. Consciousness as such, Rigpa, the Buddha nature, the ground of being, the peace that passes understanding. And there are different stories that traditions tell about this. The same phenomenology, but different metaphysics, which should tell us something, that we should be tentative about our metaphysical views, because you can have the same phenomenology and then attribute different stories to it. So this experience, especially when there's no content, is called the minimal phenomenal experience. It is the experience of pure awareness without phenomena. And it can be thought of as a space of knowing, or technically in philosophical terms, an epistemic space. Pure presence or pure being, luminous, empty openness, an inherent, and this luminous, empty awareness inherently knows itself, so it is self-knowing. And one of the classic descriptions is that, well, what's it like? Well, it's awake. So awakeness is a very important part of it. Spacious, so it's boundless. So we normally construct boundaries, the boundary of our body, the boundary of things, the boundary of this room. But in fact, the awareness doesn't have boundaries, and so the way we interpret that is boundless or infinite. And again, the same thing, that sounds arise within awareness. And so awareness itself is no sound, and there's a word for no sound, it's called silence. And again, movement happens within awareness. Phenomena move within awareness. But awareness itself is no movement. And again, the word for that is stillness. So we have spacious or boundless or infinite, silent stillness. And then the last one is probably the most wild, which is that everything that is arising within an awareness is arising. The clocks are ticking within awareness. Time is happening within awareness. So awareness is changeless. Change is happening within awareness, and awareness is changeless. And there's a word for changeless, and it's eternal or timeless. So, just a warning for those who want to, this is like awareness itself is inscrutable. In fact, if you think you found something about it, you're constructing it. So, it's a tough one. So let's look at this space of phenomenological dimensions of meditation that we talked about. The first dimension we talked about is calming the mind, quietening the mind. That was, as Payal's meditation did in the first part, we quietened our mind by focusing on our breath. And that's sometimes called shamatha meditation, calm abiding meditation. The next dimension is deconstructing our experience, or descending the cortical hierarchy, the cortical fabrication hierarchy, defabrication. And then the final dimension is this dereification or emptiness or pacification that we talked about. Seeing it's a mental construction, seeing it's just like a dream-like quality, exactly like you're sleeping, having a dream when you're sleeping at night. Now, we start off in this corner here where things are very constructed, things are very noisy, and we take them to be very real. It really matters. This is a matter of life and death that I win this game of Monopoly. No, it's just a game. And then, as we saw, we quieten the mind. Perhaps this is a novice meditator. And then a more advanced meditator would be quietening the mind quite a bit here. And then deconstruction meditation would be taking us in this 45-degree line, where we're quietening the mind, but we're also deconstructing our experience. And then perhaps more advanced deconstruction would be deconstructing it even more and quietening it even more. And if we take that further, we end up in a deep non-dual absorption state, this minimal phenomenal experience where you're totally deconstructed, things are very quiet, and it's recognized to be a mental construction. It's dereified. You see that it's made of awareness. And then we come back in the world, and this is, you might think that, of course, this minimal phenomenal experience right here in the corner is the highest thing that you can achieve in meditation. But in fact, I'll tell you that no, it's not. Coming back in the world and retaining that dereified state is the highest state. In other words, fine to have an empty generative phenomenal world model and recognize it as such, but much better to have a full generative phenomenal world model and recognize it as awareness. So that's where we end up. We end up where we started, but recognize it to be entirely fresh. So I want to take you through a particular journey because you'll hear later on this afternoon some very interesting data on this style of meditation called the jhanas, which is quite an advanced type of meditation technique. And what the jhanas are a series of meditations that deconstruct the world and defabricate the world in a particular way. And what's important about this systematic way, it comes from Buddhism, but if you look at many traditions around the world of advanced meditation techniques, they end up also deconstructing the world in this way. And many meditation practitioners end up deconstructing the world without even knowing what the jhanas are, because somehow this is fundamental. We're sort of unwinding the process of fabrication one Lego brick at a time. And you start off in this corner here, the typical non-meditative mind, lots of construction, lots of noise, monkey mind. And you first have to meditate become quite a good meditator to get something called access concentration. So that can take many years, perhaps, to do that. But at some level, when we can quieten the mind and we can really start to deconstruct it, you get to a level which is the first jhana, where you can start to construct a very special type of experience, which is that your body is no longer a solid body. It is just made of kind of energetic, vibratory champagne bubbles. And when you go into the jhana, what you do is you start to perceive that these champagne bubbles are excited, rapturous, pleasurable. So the entire absorption state, you become this rapturous, energetic, effervescent, bubbling jacuzzi. And that's a very powerful state. I mean, if you can imagine the glee, and it's quite a shock for people because we normally interact with the world to get pleasure, and then you suddenly realize, wow, this is the most intensely pleasurable state that there could be, and there is no external stimulus to this. It is entirely produced by the own body. And then at some level, you can go further than that, and you realize that no, there's something a little coarse about this, and that actually this physical rapture, there's something sweeter in there. And that sweeter something is the pure mental joy that's there. And you switch into something called the second jhana, which is even deeper and even more blissful. So it's pure joy with all the energy going on. And then if you thought that if you have sort of huge amounts of pure joy, you could say, well, I'll stay here forever. But in fact, there is something that's even more refined. You wouldn't believe it, but you would find that there's something that at the center of that joy, you find a kind of peace. And what then happens is that the energy dies down. You go beyond the energy. So the body sensations are no longer front and center, the energetic component. And what you tune into is a serene contentedness, pure, serene contentedness. What more could you want than that? But after a while, you realize that actually within that serene contentedness is something that's even more pure and lovely, which is, ironically, the deep stillness and peace and quietness. And then you go into the fourth jhana. And so that state is just pure. It's sometimes called pure equanimity. And, or I think a better term would be pure peace, pure stillness. Now, what's interesting there is still a sense of the body. Even though the body is not a solid body, there is still a sense of the body. And what happens after the fourth jhana is you completely lose a sense of the body. And that is one of the most transformative type of experiences where it's almost like you've always been wearing a shoe that's too tight, and which is your body, and then you lose your body, and then you have a sense of great freedom and liberation. And so there are no boundaries left, and that's then associated with feeling infinite space. So it's the fifth jhana is called the realm of infinite space. And so again, we're starting to deconstruct one model at a time our sensory construction. And then you come to see this space as you find all this tremendous freedom in it. And you say, well, what is this space made of? And you realize it's made of pure consciousness. And so the space goes away, and it's just infinite consciousness. So now this is the sixth jhana, and the sixth jhana is very important in many spiritual traditions. In fact, the sixth jhana is probably a common base that is rediscovered in many traditions, the realm of infinite consciousness or pure awareness. But you can go further. You can go further, because if you really look at the nature of this consciousness, as I sort of hinted at before, you'll see that even any idea of what this is a construction. And so then you end up seeing that it's made of pure nothingness. And so this is the realm of infinite nothingness. And so there is no body, there's just pure infinite nothingness. And that's a very, very liberating state. But if you can imagine, if you were ever thrown into that void, maybe through psychedelics or through my meditation before you're ready or something, it can be very frightening. So if you ever find yourself there, relax and enjoy it. Now, you might say that there's nowhere to go beyond nothing. And in fact, you might think that, but there is still one thing that's left, which is the perception of nothingness. And the perception of nothingness is still a kind of construction. And so the eighth jhana, which is probably something like the minimal phenomenal experience, is not even constructing, or somehow half constructing, half perceiving. It's technically called the state of neither perception yet not non-perception. So it's a very curious state. And then after that, there is a potential for all experience to blink out, and that's called a cessation. So this is this journey of the jhanas, which I think are very important. And if I still have time, okay, I'll very quickly. So you might say, okay, well, this is really an amazing thing, but what are we doing it for? What is it all for? It was for, didn't the Buddha say it was for the alleviation of suffering? It was to make you happy? Well, this is also a construction. So, suffering is caused by 4 components. One is having some sort of negative affective valence. That's a technical term for example, think of it like a pain. Some negative emotion or negative experience. The second is being aware of it, being conscious. The third is that it's my pain. So you don't suffer if there's some pain out there. You might have some empathy, but it's my pain. That's having a phenomenal self-model. And the fourth is that it's real. It's real. So we need 4 things to suffer. Now, if you, when you're in this suffering, what happens is that you tend to increase self-centered rumination, which is this default mode network, because you want to figure out, how do I get out of this? And so it starts actually increasing your self-centered egoic thoughts of rumination. And that actually tends to increase the phenomenal self-model. It actually makes a stronger version. Why is this always happening to me? You actually focus on the self so much that it becomes a stronger component of the modeling process. And then it also, all this rumination, this is always happening to me, the world's a terrible place, increases the negative affective valence. And having a stronger self-model also means that you're modeling it more strongly, and so it becomes more real to you. It actually increases the transparency. It reifies the self-model even more. And unfortunately, when you start thinking about the self all the time, that's what's dominating your thought process, and so there's less care for others in the world, which is one of the sort of sad things, is that when you have someone who's very depressed, they're really self-centered, and actually they can be kind of a little selfish. Now, what happens if we start to transform the phenomenal experience through meditation? Well, you start to see the transparency becoming opaque. And so you say, well, this is not really real. This is just a kind of, I can see, it's just a modeling process. And what that does is you see that the self that you took as very real is just kind of an illusion. And what that does is it changes this picture entirely. And so what you get, instead of this vicious cycle that I showed you before, you start to develop this virtuous cycle. So we get less self-centered rumination, we get more care for others, we get less negative affective valence, less pain and actual negative emotions, and less suffering. And then there are all sorts of ramifications that come off that. We have more action into the world. You end up changing your priors around your habits. You get better mood. You get a change in who you think you are. And this cycle, this virtuous cycle, can be called the good life or human flourishing. And so that's really what meditation is about. Why we're constructing our world, and if we learn how to deconstruct it and make it more de-reified, we will end up going into a virtuous cycle, turning a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. So that's how we can rewire our reality. So may we flourish together. Thank you. I see we still have 6 minutes left for questions, which is good.
Thank you so much. My question is around breathing. For me, when I'm in that deep state, I basically forget to breathe. And it goes to a point where I'm thinking, am I going to die? Like, why am I not breathing? It's alarming.
That's a multi-layered question, and I don't want to kind of... I will say that I think that idea that I'm not breathing is just a symptom of something much deeper. And that deeper thing is that you feel like you're going to die. And that's okay, because what's happening is that the model, the ego, thinks it's going to die, and that's a very, very important stage. So if you feel safe, the general view would be relax and allow it. Don't worry, you'll breathe.
Thank you. Amazing talk. I'm wondering, does predictive processing have anything to say about the balance between acceptance and actually creating change, that, like eating or paying bills?
So, I mean, predictive processing is just a technical, quantitative, computational technique. Everything that we bring to it is philosophy. And I think what's behind your question is really important. And as you saw, this is not just about equanimity. What I tried to show at the end was this entire flourishing life, if you look at this picture here, which I think is a very nice one, you see you have all this stuff emerging, and what emerges is the idea of being a part of a flourishing world. So my own view is that certainly you could just sit in a Himalayan cave and be in equanimity, or you could be back in the world and back in the dream and making it beautiful. So that's what I'd recommend.
Thank you. Could you say something from an evolutionary biological perspective? Because I understand that reasoning in concepts and language is only 200,000-300,000 years old. But we as hominins have existed for more than 5 million. So it seems like the glorification of concepts and focusing on the thinking has made us lose touch with somehow surviving and being able to move in the world.
Yeah, no, very good. I mean, look, I think, so there are two parts to this. I think we can separate evolution with concepts. So the first point is that evolution has really has created this whole system of the phenomenal world model to allow us to survive. Because if we couldn't figure out the causes of our sensory data, if we couldn't figure out where the food was and where the lion was, we would die. So we need to figure out what's going on in the world. That's the whole point. Even from a basic bacteria has some chemosensors to figure out where the sugar is and where the acid is. So move away from the acid and go towards the sugar. So we need a way of constructing what we think is going on in the world so we can act appropriately to increase the chance of our survival. So this mechanism, and in fact, as I said, the phenomenal self-model itself is a crucial part of it. So evolution is absolutely central. But then abstraction and language is, in a way, the flower of evolution in humans. And I think it's great, actually. I think that initially, concepts and language and all this kind of stuff can be a bit of a bother for meditators because it's so sticky that we can't get out of our minds and our thinking minds, and we can't quieten the mind. But that's a stage-dependent thing. In the end, we want to be back with our thoughts. We want to be able to dance beautifully, actually flourish, including intellectually flourish. If you want to change the world, you need to think about it. So I think all our human capacities are excellent. The problem is taking them too seriously.
So I'm not sure how to ask this question, but so I've been in the meditation circles for almost 15 years, and I don't know how you describe the self and how we construct it is just mind-blowing. Like suddenly I just got this huge insight. I've been making myself up and making myself a really big deal my whole life, and my problems and the things that are happening. And so thank you for that. Of course, in meditation, we have relief. Sometimes in meditation, it feels like, oh, thank God, like I'm out of my blah, 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 about myself, and we're in this spaciousness. But I'm actively working on being in that spaciousness and not in the thoughts of the self, the constructed self. How do you believe that technology can bridge that gap? Because technology can't erase my construction of self. You know, I wish it could, but it can't. I don't think it can. Like, that's my work. Like, it's my work and my intention to get there. I'm imagining that perhaps technology can calm the nervous system enough that we can just like stop the default mode network, which is constantly constructing ourselves, can turn off. What do you think?
I think that's great. And I think, they asked us to give some questions on the panel this afternoon, and my question was exactly how can we use technology to increase meditation? And I'm very interested in that, in biophotomodulation, focused ultrasound, brain stimulation. And one thing I just wanted to say is that you said we want to erase ourselves. I think it's not that we want to erase ourselves. In fact, when you see very awakened people, and they still have personalities, it's just that they know those personalities are empty. They know that they're constructions, but they can still play their role, they can still be the character. And so what technology can help us with is to increase the meditation, allow the meditation process so that we can recognize the constructed nature of our reality and get some proficiency and ultimately become the master of the generative model. This is what I think meditative development really ends up in, is to become the master of your constructed world. And then how do we want to construct it so that we can dance most beautifully in the world?
Thank you, Dr. Chandaria.
I think I'm out of time.
Yes, that's it for questions, but please save them for the panel. Thank you so much.